All right, welcome back to what I guess we should call something like Side Quests VIII, Side Quest 8 or something like that, since Wes Schantz and I are here again without too much further ado to discuss Final Fantasy VIII. Many years now after discussing Final Fantasy VII and delving a little bit into Chrono Trigger. Wes Schantz, good to see you in this new 2025 year for this new venture on this old golden age PlayStation game. How are you doing, my friend?
It's good to see you too. It's a good day to be out of school talking about video games. And on my end here, I've been very limited in my time with the game so far. I don't have any like extant save from back when I used to play it. I don't know, 20 years ago or something. I don't think I've replayed this one since it first came out and I first started it. And at some point I deleted that save file to make room for something else on my memory card. I was hoping that I could kind of cheat when we started this one up and I could find an old save and just like pick up, midway through or however far I had gotten. And that ship has sailed, unfortunately. So I just
Wow,
started
so that's
over.
questions in my mind. One is this. So you're still playing on the PS1 console that was just the PlayStation at the time, the gray
I
rectangle
have
thing.
I may have a PS1 somewhere, but what I have set up right now is my PS2, and
Okay, so
that's as far as I went with PlayStation. That's the newest PlayStation device that I have access to, and
so
it
you
plays the PS1 game. So it's the original PS1 game with an original PS1 memory card, which is completely full in the PS2 console.
what
What about
so
you?
what is the memory card full of? That's the most interesting thing. What have you saved? What has been saved
Oh,
throughout
I
time?
see what you're saying. I so like when I went back and played Xenogears a few years ago, my old save for Xenogears is still on there. I have a couple of Final Fantasy VII saves from various times that I replayed that over the years. I have stuff for um like Legend of Mana and Wild Arms. Um there's just all kinds of Final Fantasies on there. I think there's a 9, there's a Tactics. There's, like I said, a couple sevens and nothing for 8. Eight is kind of the black sheep. I mean, this is how it has been seen traditionally, and you know, there's people out there who argue that you know, it's just as good or it's better than the more beloved Final Fantasies from that generation. But no, it kind of never quite clicked for me. And to this day, as you can see, I'm still struggling to engage with it in the same way that perhaps it deserves.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I have seen a lot of the critical commentary about Final Fantasy VIII. Though recently, I've been watching a little bit of Resonant Arc in preparation for this to see just how complicated the storyline actually happens to be, and actually
Mm.
is for Final Fantasy VIII with the whole time compression element, which I guess we'll be getting into, and what the scale and scope of the mythology underlying it happened to be with the sorceresses and the passing on of power and this interestingly and this interesting figure of Adele and
Mm.
Estar, which we'll learn about, and Ultimecia and the relationship to this character that we have yet to meet, Renoa,
Mhm.
and but who is figured as the sort of sigil of Final Fantasy VIII alongside Squall, a figure of Squall that doesn't look very much like Squall. Uh,
Well, that's the thing, right? The concept art always looks even cooler and more stylized than the actual game art. And I don't know if that is intentional, like they they just want to have like the vision of the imagination of what the game could be, sort of imprint on you first, and then they just make do with the technology that's available at the time, um, or if that's a vestige of some of the earlier games that then they just kind of kept going with to maintain the brand, you know, like, well, this artist uh, has been with us this long, we'll stick with him, even though, you know, by the time they're in PlayStation era, um, they could have decided because the graphics of the game are so different, because the technology is so different, we want to change how we brand the series, and they stuck with it, and it has that very recognizable um, that that style um, straight through the whole series. So, you know, as much as one game doesn't directly connect with another, there's these kind of aesthetic qualities, right? That tie them all together.
Well, that really resonates with me, but I want to jump back into so how we're playing them. So neither of us has PlayStation. So you're playing on a PS2, not the original PS1. I'm playing sort of both on the PS3 that I bought years ago now for our Final Fantasy VII series, but also on the PS4 that I bought to play the Final Fantasy VII remake, which if I can convince you to play Final Fantasy VIII, maybe I can convince you to play that at some point. Though maybe you'll need 3 different systems by the end, or only one on which features backwards compatibility with 3 through a PS4, 5, and 6, depending on how long they can stretch this thing out. But I think it may just be PS4 and 5. That said, I have the game downloaded, not in physical copy, on the PS3 and the PS4. And given the nature of these systems, they no longer use the physical hardware of a memory card, and so I do save at save points and have a memory card slot that digitally represents itself, but there's no physical memory card
Right.
at this point. So there's some backward compatibility. To the point you made about not resonating with this game, I wanted to touch on that in 2 different ways. One is I wanted to mention my sort of idiosyncratic personalist connection to this game, which may have affected my critical judgment when I first read it. And the second is talking about the relationship between Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy VII, and perhaps Final Fantasy VI, and whether in pushing the envelope in 6 and 7 and sort of getting away from the medieval fantasy topos towards a more sci-fi, towards more science fiction oriented worlds, whether they maybe pushed the genre too far when it finally got to Final Fantasy VIII, or whether it was something else. I think is not just one criticism of Final Fantasy VIII. I mean, it does have perhaps the most robust mythology of any of the earlier or the first 10 games or so, but it doesn't always come together for people. But so my little personal connection was that I first received this game as a gift from my paternal grandparents on Christmas when I was 14 in 8th grade, right after I had just gotten a PlayStation, I think also for Christmas, and received with it Final Fantasy VII, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, the first one, and then also Final Fantasy VIII as a gift. And so my very first experience with the PlayStation and with RPGs on a then next-gen console, I had played something like Final Fantasy III on the Game Boy, like Final Fantasy Legend, which is very unrelated.
Yeah.
Learn how to play an RPG. I played Pokemon in the past, but I was told that was nowhere near advanced enough to encounter Final Fantasy VII, and I was a little bit slow to the game, late to the game with Final Fantasy VII, because I seem to recall that it came out 1997, back when I was in, I think I was even in 5th grade, maybe preparing to go to 6th grade at that time, and so this was 8th grade. So I was late to 7, but I was basically on time to 8, because it was the first, I think, Final Fantasy, and maybe even, I don't want to say video game, but I think the first Final Fantasy, and maybe the first Japanese video game to have a commercial and like a cinematic trailer that they featured as a commercial, that really, really got me excited for it, particularly because of the level of cinematic design that this game brought. That they were continuing what they had just started in Final Fantasy VII, but it looked even more visually stunning. and impressive. And this was at least a time in my life when I was transitioning from Game Boy. There had been the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo. Now there was the PlayStation and the N64, where stunning graphics was just was in some ways the standard by which games were, at least one of the major standards by which games were judged. How stunning is this game? And the question would arise, well, is the gameplay good? Is the story good? You need to think about these other things before you judge a game. But the representation and the representational element of games was something we were transfixing on, especially as consoles got more and more powerful. I think the changes nowadays are a little subtler than they were back then, when we went, say, from 2-dimensional models to 3D models all of a sudden, and had sort of physio-spatial dimensional shifts, huge shifts, cosmic level shifts in what we could represent, to now, it's like the frame rate is faster and the load times are slower, or faster rather, depending on how much data is being conferred. But I first played Final Fantasy VII and VIII in conjunction with each other, and so I love them both. And it might be the case that part of why I love Final Fantasy VIII is that it was part of my initial delving into the PlayStation. And also, I played it alongside Final Fantasy VII, which was such a critical success, so much so that it has been entirely remade with a whole cadre of additional games added onto it, whereas Final Fantasy VIII simply has a single remaster. And I am playing the remastered so that I can see the faces and not just the blurry sort of blobs that I grew up projecting my fantasies onto. I should also mention that in 8th grade at that time, I was at a new school and I was a little bit lonely. So I think part of the ethos, part of the theme of Final Fantasy VIII, just take this surly, though extraordinarily gifted and handsome guy, which I was not at that time. I was an awkward 8th grader. And they teach him how to make friends and give him all of these friends, who apparently will have been people back in his orphanage at one point, though they will have lost their memories. Spoiler alert. But something about his process of becoming a friend to other people really resonated with me. And though I think, broadly speaking, one could say that the same thing happened with Cloud, as he goes from this cold mercenary to this person involved not only with this group, but with these people who become his friends. So, the Avalanche terrorism group sort of falls away, and then these group of individuals fighting for the safety of the planet sort of emerge, no longer really called Avalanche. Or that sort of falls away with Shinra, with the Midgar section of Final Fantasy VII. But that seems to be a much bigger thrust here in Final Fantasy VIII, and something about that seems not to resonate with most people. I wouldn't necessarily say I would try and pinpoint that, but though there are elements of that in Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII is a critical success. People still consider it one of the greatest games ever made. Final Fantasy VIII, not often even included as one of the greatest Final Fantasy games. And often even put beneath more modern ones like Final Fantasy XVI, which a lot of people seem to like, and even 12 and 13, which there's a lot of debate about too. 12 seems to be the sort of modern next-gen correlate to Final Fantasy VIII, though for some differing reasons, especially given its sort of return to a fantasy world like Final Fantasy IX. But so I all of that is just a long-winded way of saying, what do you think did not attract you to this game? What were the circumstances under which you originally played it, and why do you think you liked Final Fantasy VII, and maybe for that matter Chrono Trigger and Xenogears, so much more than this one?
Yeah, that is, I think that's a question that I have some insight on with the benefit of hindsight here, because I will say that the jump between the Super Nintendo games that I first kind of played growing up when I was a good deal younger, right? And in some cases didn't play so much as watch older neighbors playing, right? And that was my first impression of what these games are supposed to be. And so the jump from that to the generation of the first PlayStation and then beyond, was pretty steep for me to make. And I think I only got into Final Fantasy VII because I had a good friend who really liked it and wanted to play it. And so with with that to push me, I was like, okay, I will look past these like remarkable graphics because for me that was like actually a drawback. I didn't want to see cinematics. I didn't want to see realism, quote unquote, um, in my Final Fantasy game. I wanted to have the experience that I had to that point grown up with and grown familiar with and really enjoyed, which was r- more of more of something like reading a book where my imagination is involved in filling out the blurry faces, right? The pixelated faces in that case. And and a kind of schematic story is good enough because what I was after was a certain kind of yeah, like freedom to explore, I guess you'd say, and to fill out with my own um, creativity the kind of simple game that was before me. Um, so Final Fantasy VII was a stretch for me, but once I got into it, I really enjoyed it. I think like just having that, as you say, the friendship is crucial in all of these games, and having that to spur me on to play it was important there. But even that, I don't think I actually finished Final Fantasy VII the first time I tried to play it. And Final Fantasy VIII, when it came around and I was playing it more or less on my own. I didn't have anybody else around who wanted to play it initially. Um, that one, even more so, I bounced off of because it felt like it was too, uh, too shiny, um, too too realistic, and the kinds of concerns that the game poses are more or less, a refinement of the formula from Seven. You have characters who have a memory loss sort of amnesia thing going on. You have these incredible, powerful spirits, right, in the Guardian forces that in some way are interacting with and even serving what look like, ordinary kids. And then you have the thing with the sorceress, which I guess would be or more or less analogous to a kind of big bad, right? A Sephiroth type figure. Um, and so I guess there isn't that much difference um, in the storyline. It's just pushing it further and pushing the graphics further. And I think I just spent a lot of time in the game, um, not really connecting with the world and the systems. Um, certain things about it were just like a little bit uh, hard for me to like grasp, I guess, like the draw system. Right. So then the mechanics of some of the like upgrades that happen connected with um, using magic, using items. I was just like, I don't know how to do this well. Um, and it's taking a lot of time, and there's other things that I'd rather do. And so at a certain point, like I said, probably like midway through the game, it just became like too many things to manage within the game, like keeping track of who was using which Guardian Force. And I, that is, I think like I maybe I got to the part where they revealed that all the people in the party were orphans together. Um, the thing that I like best about the game uh, was the kind of flashback sequences where you're playing as Laguna and that difference, um, even within the game, of something that felt uh, like older, I guess, um, was appealing. I liked how there was that jumping back and forth in time, but I didn't like it enough to like keep going and figure out how this all fit together. Um, and it's really interesting because I guess a few years after that, probably a game like Chrono Cross comes along, which I do really enjoy. Like from the start, I'm really like enchanted by that game, and yet I still didn't ever finish playing that game. um, I it's like a tendency of mine, I guess, to play a game, get only so far, and then I I'm not much of a completionist in sort of a linear sense. Like I don't have to get to the end of the game or the main story, um, because I guess I just start to like think about little details um and get distracted by other things going on, and I think my gameplay in that way is kind of idiosyncratic. And I'll say I never really connected with another Final Fantasy after seven, because each of the newer ones was more and more of like uh, this is this is the things I disliked about seven, but more so, right? So I did eventually play nine and 10. I played a little bit of 12, like very little, and I don't have the hardware to play anything beyond that, so haven't gotten there.
Well, so that's really interesting, Wes, because and I would like to talk a little bit about Final Fantasy IX, which is sometimes considered the throwback to the medieval
Mhm.
fantasy world that people seem to have bemoaned the loss of in Final Fantasy VII and VIII, and to some extent six. But you seem to be
Mhm.
suggesting something that I think is really interesting and telling, which is that the fantasy is not so much contrasted with sci-fi, but realism,
Mhm. Mhm.
pushing towards realism through producing these next gen, these newer, hipper consoles like the original PlayStation and its 32 bits of
CD
representation,
technology though. That's CD.
right? And CD technology, like these seeds that we see here, um, was um, was a push towards greater verisimilitude in video game representation, from 2D scrollers to sort of 2D models that can work on a more three-dimensional or go in four directions rather than say two. And the two are not backwards and forwards, but up and into forwards, right? In the case
Mm.
of say a
X and Y.
Mario,
Yeah.
sometimes Sonic, depending on uh, the course that one happens to be in. Though the Sega Genesis, I'm told, was a little bit more powerful than the Super Nintendo, which is why Sonic was a little more dynamic than Mario. Not because he was a anthropomorphic accelerated hedgehog. There's apparently sort of an alien from space, according to the movies now. Um,
Oh
uh,
dear.
and yeah, well, but so you might be touching on something that is both key to being a human, to being a young human and imprinting, and why young people like sort of game stories, because there's something interesting about what an RPG is, which joins math and game and story all together. I mean, there are jokes about RPGs that it's like this is just math, this that with a bunch of images attached to it, and you have to, and something about chance and the roll of the dice and the fact that you might do this much damage, and you need to generate, or you have to defeat this enemy with this much HP. So you need to know how many turns that you're going to be able to do that in, and whether it's going to be able to demolish you before that. And so there's strategy, math, decision making that are all, and risk taking, that are all part of the game, which I think hugely increase the emotional investment that one feels, or terrifically increase the emotional investment that one feels, because one's, like gambling, when one throws the dice, one's putting faith in one's decision, perhaps even when they're a bad decision, because I often would take gambles when I played,
Yeah.
and even if I knew the decision wouldn't necessarily work, I sort of had a nascent faith in myself. But what you're saying is that the more realistically portrayed the characters were, the less you could sort of add from your own imaginative world to them, as if what you wanted to do while you were growing up as a preteen and then a teen, and or yeah, preteen, like 10, 12, 14, 15 age, is, I don't know, it sounds like you're sort of trying to construct yourself or your reality, and that these games were sort of jump off points, like how Emerson
Yeah.
says about reading literature. It's not about just ingesting the literature and knowing what has been written, but generating one's own thoughts. And so
Yeah.
even though these games became more, in some ways, magnificent works of, I don't want to say necessarily magnificent technical productions, let's say, rather than works of art. And so much time and these and effort and money are put into them. The consoles that are generated, or the consoles on which they are featured, become more technical and sophisticated as well. All of that is cool and perhaps economically good for Square and then Square Enix, or useful, but that something about the essence of your connection to a game is lost. That there's an over representation. There's
Right.
in representing the worlds in a too nuanced or a too detailed way, the necessary bridge between the subject and the object is in some way damaged. And so it is like reading that, like the damage or the violence that many readers feel when they see their favorite characters portrayed in movies and movie adaptations of their favorite novels, that they've now lost the capacity to simply imagine these characters as they wished to within the confines of the written word. And so I guess this all goes to say, is sort of a question: do you think this is that part of the problem you have is a problem of adaptation and over adaptation, and that part of what maybe you loved in the earlier games was something that you helped to provide yourself?
I think so. I think it's the kind of involvement, and I to the point of the movies, right? When Square Sakaguchi goes and makes a movie, it's a disaster, right? It almost sinks them, um, and it's too bad because that was kind of an important part of the vision, um, and especially at that time, the aspiration of video games, the pretension to art, went by way of film for a lot of people, and there was this kind of ambition to create something that could be seen as, standing toe to toe with films in terms of quality. Uh, it wasn't quite there yet for them at that time, and and maybe it was going about it the wrong way, right? Barking up the wrong tree. Maybe to me at least, it's always been literature, which is the closer analog or the more appropriate sense in which playing games is like experiencing works of art. Maybe painting, right? Something that you stand before, you contemplate, you sort of explore the details of, and then you compile a kind of picture of it and the way in which you connect with it, the way it connects to other things, that kind of constellating quality, that the history of art, the history of literature, the history of music, right? So it's an amalgamation of other art forms. It might yearn to be a film in some ways, but in so doing, it might lose some of the really essential pieces of what make the video game so special. Um, the thing about like going to the movies, right? You are passive. You are getting to experience almost like someone else's dream, and there's something wonderful about that. Um, but uh, when you play a video game that, especially one like Zelda or Earthbound, that have these silent protagonists, right? There is a very strong sense of imprinting, right? The character is called Link because he's a link between the player and the game, right? And there's this like recognition of that on the part of certain creators, and there's a kind of like attempt to, get away from that on the part of others, and both are necessary, right? There's a push and a pull, and that I think is good for the medium overall. It just means that there's plenty of for me false starts and interesting failures along the way. Um, and again, with hindsight, I think I can maybe better appreciate certain things that just really uh, were hard for me to connect with initially. And part of that, I think, I mean, we should look at the opening cinematic of this game, right? Like, it is very different from the one that starts off Final Fantasy VII, or six for that matter, right? There's a kind of film crawl thing that happens with the credits rolling in Final Fantasy VI. Um, Even in Final Fantasy IV, right, released as two, there's this moment as you're leaving the castle, having been kind of exiled, basically. on this mission that this kind of text comes down the screen in a really cinematic way. So this is something that has always been like a part of the games. In Final Fantasy VIII, though, it's extended. It is more impressive visually, and then it also very quickly, like the part where you are finally in control of the character and you're walking out, there's this thing where the camera like swerves around and you see like the garden as its architecture, as its kind of shininess. Again, that that aspect of it, it's embedded in the gameplay to a much greater degree this time, and it's something that with a game that comes out not so long after. It's like the difference between Metal Gear Solid and Metal Gear Solid 2, right? And this kind of trend in that series to go pretty much full cinematic. You're basically just watching a movie where you kind of push a button every so often, right? And it's very disappointing to a lot of people. It's very, wonderful to others because you can tell certain kinds of stories that way. But anyway, so the Final Fantasy VIII opening cinematic, uh, it's cool. It's got a lot of interesting imagery, um, but it 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 leaves you lying on a hospital bed, right? And I can't help but feel like that's kind of a metaphor for how you as the player are feeling, just sort of like I'm just kind of passively taking in this dream right now, and that's okay. That is what it is.
That's really interesting because you're making me think that because Metal Gear Solid and Metal Gear Solid 2 make this sort of jump between gameplay that wants to have more cinematic more cinematics present and and a larger presence of cinematics within the work, and to some extent that the desire for that was then answered by the creators then tarnished or hurt the gameplay to some extent. I think to some extent I see the same thing happen between Xenogears and Xenosaga.
Yes,
Uh,
good
and
example.
I think a major criticism of Xenosaga was you just watch it. And even these days with Hogwarts Legacy, there is a sort of easy cinematic mode where mostly you're just sort of watching it. But this the transition from playing to watching strikes me as in some ways similar to the transition from projecting one's fantasies to too much realism. That though there was a desire for a greater level of art and mastery in the representation, there was an equivalent or greater desire to maintain the autonomy or the agency of the player. I think I see another parallel with, say, open world games like Elder Scrolls Morrowind. Again, very early on in the RPG sort of golden age moment, there was a desire for open worlds and greater immersion, and that has come. And there have been major criticisms of. There are people that love open worlds. There are people that don't love them, and then there are criticisms of open worlds and traditional Final Fantasies, and that now we have had Final Fantasies like Final Fantasy X and I believe 13 that are almost linear.
Yeah.
And so one sees the creators and the writers and the changing elements and relations between them attempting to satisfy differing desires of the fan base, which is what the original fan base is now us aging millennials, no longer children. And then there are emerging new fans who are the ages that we were when we were first playing these games as well. And how are they possibly going to satisfy this much larger range of fans? Whereas I think we were far more localized in the golden age. It was mostly like 10 to 14-year-olds or 10 to 18-year-olds that were who had grown up playing these games that were sort of evolving or developing alongside them, and Nintendo, SNES, and Sega Genesis, 32X, Dreamcast eventually after I guess CD and the Sega Saturn. There we are. And then N64, PlayStation 2, and so on and so forth. But do you think this is a hard question to ask because there are perhaps two major causes for it. Do you think part of what diminishes one's love of Final Fantasy VIII compared to Final Fantasy VII is the fact that you had already imprinted to some extent, had these formative
Yeah.
experiences with a different console, with a different game, with a different genre, which allowed you to do the necessary projecting work in order to develop yourself, or that the creators had, in order to fulfill the desires of a gamer who was maybe you, that maybe wanted more cinematic or wanted more
Mhm.
realism, that they moved away from somebody of, say, your temperament. And I guess a larger question from this would be, do you think maybe the producers of the Final Fantasy games at times forget the sort of temperament that is attracted to an RPG fantasy based game? That it is almost surely going to be somebody. I just remember one of your podcasts with a friend of yours growing up who really liked I think playing like a Star Wars like shooter, like Rogue One. He likes shooter games and
Mhm.
racing games, and you obviously like RPGs the most. And part of that might be because your temperament is creative and you are attracted to something that you can put your own stamp on, but that not just you, but anybody who is temperament creative and may want more of a canvas on which to project themselves
Mhm.
than a canvas or something like a, I don't know, fill in the blank or paint your own colors experience, rather than something that is completely filled out and totally structured and defined, um uh regardless of one's style of play slash temperament. I don't know if that was a
Yeah,
great question. It was a lot of words. I'm sorry.
I think, I mean, of the dilemma there, I mean, I think that there's probably more of the former where, yeah, I was captivated by a much simpler kind of game, and that was good enough, and I couldn't really um, see improving on it, right? The model of games like Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, the Super Nintendo Final Fantasies, those for me are what this genre does best. And so other things which do maybe other things better, right, are missing kind of the essential quality of that experience. And nevertheless, I'm sure that there's plenty of people who played Final Fantasy VIII first, right? Or games even further down the spectrum of cinematic, of high graphical fidelity, realism, if you want to call it that, right? And then so when they go back and play FF8, they can still more easily connect with it rather than something seven or earlier, which is just so like disastrously visually unappealing that they can't get into it. I could see that being a thing. Um, on the other hand, um, being a more creatively inclined person, I would want to say that I would also be open enough to sit with something that was falling short of expectations. And I would be willing to sort of think about the ways that what it was trying to do was interesting, even if it wasn't what I personally kind of liked. You know what I'm saying? Now, that again, that's an investment of time, mental effort, and sympathy that are tiring, right? It is like there's a lot of other things that I might want to do with my time, and so I have to see this in terms of maybe more of a larger project for it to be worth doing something like that. And I think only recently have I started to really think of it, conceive of it that way. And maybe uh, that means that I don't actually end up playing this game all that long, but I do end up watching a playthrough of it or reading somebody's uh, scholarship about it or whatever it might be, right? And so that the experience of playing it is a piece of a kind of larger, scholarly project of understanding the medium, the ways that it's changed, the genre of the particular Japanese role-playing game or RPGs writ large, um, and and of course all of the technological changes that go along with that, right? So I think there's some really interesting things there. The personality of the player, the personal histories of the player, fit into that. And and I think their willingness, maybe I'm just saying my willingness to play games that they don't immediately enjoy, right, is always sort of a very difficult step for people to take. Plenty of people who aren't willing to do that will never play games of a genre other than the one they like best, right? So for most people, that's not RPGs, right? Just looking at like what are the popular games, what are the ones that people spend the most time and money on? They're a little bit more action oriented usually. Maybe they have elements of online play and competitiveness that are stuff that I just like don't care about at all personally. So my circle of like I'm willing to play this thing even though I don't like it, it extends only so far. And I think that's okay, right? I think it's interesting the ways that um, certain people's uh, like experiences with games are seem so very limited, um, and there might be certain ways around that, um, but it really is an open question to me, like what the future of these old games is. Um, to what extent people will ever genuinely want to play them versus feeling some kind of like antiquarian, like curiosity about them or something like that in the future.
That
Because games
really,
have come so far, they're so far away from it.
sorry, that, I mean, I think that really is an important element because part of playing Final Fantasy VIII at the time when I was playing it was that it was cutting edge, that the strategy guide was coming out. There were commercials about it. It was made for the console that was the most the most powerful console in existence at the time. That there were other young people my age playing this game and comparing it to Final Fantasy VII, regardless of how good it was. Add to it the fact that, when I was growing up, when I was engaging with media, the highest level engagement was video.
Mm,
Watching a movie, again, not as interactive, not as engaging, not as immersive as playing the video game. And so it's funny to me now to see that we're clearly in different stages in our lives because part of the sort of Bildungsroman built into each Final Fantasy, but especially on the nose with Final Fantasy VIII, which again may make it a little bit less palatable, is so obviously a romance. I mean, given the decal, the top, and it's so obviously about this guy coming out of his shell who's got even less personality than Cloud. He's progressed from Cloud to Squall, right? And he ignores people in a way that no real human, I used to try and act like him and people would be like, hey, talk, you can't, you don't seem to be able to just dot people in reality as much as he does.
does
But
it?
now I see it's funny, you have, developed as a person and now you find that you are more willing to watch videos of people playing, which is
Mm,
itself a step farther removed from watching just a cinematic portrayal of art, right? This is now a portrayal of somebody else interacting with the experience that you can observe without yourself having to interact. It strikes me as a thought I used to have when I was a young baseball player that I was like, I would never want to be a coach because I want to play the game more than anything. And now, as an adult and as a teacher and as a coach, I I appreciate the game so much more than the simple interaction with it that I had as a player. That I the greater scope of understanding that I have of, say, a game like baseball or a video game like Final Fantasy VIII, now having investigated, the legends and mythologies
mm,
underlying it, and in large part discovering what I set out to discover. The pleasure is, like Aristotle would say, it's no longer in just activity like the active man, but it is in contemplation. And there are many people that know this idiotic quote, which is a misquote, which they say, those who can do and those who can't teach. That's a misquote of
mm,
Aristotle from the Metaphysics, where he says, those who can do, those who understand, teach. And so now that you have this larger scholarly project, which involves continuing to understand and build yourself as you start, as you did when you were younger, but now as a more nuanced, complicated, sophisticated being, You have a far more complicated and sophisticated approach, an approach that I think you as a young person would not understand at all. Maybe you would,
Right.
but I would not have. I'd be like, but you're not playing the video game? That's the best part, Wes. Talking about it, thinking about it. I mean, that's great and all. It's studying it, but you play it, right? It strikes me of Jonah Hill's character in a Leonardo DiCaprio film where Leonardo DiCaprio's character is drinking non-alcoholic beer, and he says, "But you get drunk, right?" And DiCaprio's character says, "No, it's non-alcoholic." And he's like, he just can't. Jonah Hill's character can't understand it. He's like, "Well, I love getting messed up." He's like, "I can go buy you a beer." And Leonardo DiCaprio's character's like, "No, no, no. You, you can see the differing levels of maturity between them,
Yeah.
right? The one has gone past that he ends up saying that he misses getting messed up and is so bored now, but is at least a step beyond being the addict that he was at that moment, and that he is being abstinent. And it's almost like unthinkable. You have this chance now to play this game that you had played as a youth that you didn't like that much, so maybe not that unthinkable, but the real virtue of the experience doesn't come from the gameplay itself now, but what is produced as a consequence of thinking about the gameplay. And it's not only about the game, but about what a human is by way of thinking about your own response to the game. And how you go about generating that now, because I feel the same. I remember when we first talked about Final Fantasy VII, I said it felt much more like a chore going through the game than it did when I was younger. Because I would escape reality and I would be able to be these extremely talented, skilled individuals that were respected and feared in the world with weapons. And now when I leave the world to play one of these games, the experience is not as well. I don't go from being like a very, I don't know, a young person that's completely inhibited by circumstance and ability and size and social norms. Now I go from being the adult I always wanted to be back into this vessel that is made to produce an adult. And it makes me think what I always thought when I played these games, which is, well, these games are good for now, but I need to become somebody like the heroes in these games. And I think it might even be an indication of psychic health with us, that we can't just push ourselves back into the mold, right? We can't have our original experiences. Again, these propaedeutics, or these games acted as propaedeutics or pedagogical tools that got us from one step to another. And to some extent, it's sad to acknowledge that they had a particular effect on us at a particular time. Like I would also say Harry Potter did, because I was 12 when it first came out, very similar in age to Harry Potter. But now Harry is still, 12 to 17, and I am in my 30s. And so I am no longer at Hogwarts. I'm not a Gryffindor. I'm an adult. But so it's really interesting to look at analyzing these games and going back through these games, not with, I would say, the sort of delusional, quixotic desire to renew the original experience, to have a second honeymoon with the game, but to understand that that's because we imprint amazingly, but also sadly, we're past the moment when a game, and this is maybe the question I want to have is, are we past the moment when a game can have that sort of soul defining effect on one? And as an extension of that question, are we past being able to have that moment with a piece of music, with a piece of literature? Are we now in the time of life where we can appreciate these pieces, but we can't be formed by them? We're not in our 20s. We're in our late 30s now. We're still young by the standards of our time, but I think something I've seen in the millennial discourse that I see over and over again is people wanting their original experiences with games and not having them, and then other people sort of making fun of them or disparaging them for wanting an experience as powerful as the initial formative experience.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree that it's a mistake to want that sort of escapism. I don't think that it means that there isn't value in going back and replaying a game, much like going back and rereading a book, you'll see new things in it each time, and you'll make new connections. And uh, there might be ways to think of it. Yeah, I like the example of coaching versus playing the sport. You know, being the player versus being the coach. Um, you perceive and you strategize, and you just think about it from a different standpoint. And so, of course, your experience of that is going to be, uh, you know, changed accordingly. There's also, I mean, I really do think there's the element of teaching or coaching or training, um, the element of helping to form other people and helping them form their own character, right? That these games remain really powerful for. Um, and and unlike when we were that age, I don't know that people would find them on their own in quotes, right? Like the the work of merchandising and advertising is not directing people toward these games quite the way that it did at the time.
Right.
And so their attention, their money is their time is being channeled towards other things, which I really think are inferior and are actually maybe corrupting. Now that's what old people always say about the things the young people do, but I don't know that old people are always very good at remembering what it was like to be that age and seeing the kinds of things that they did at that age, and then saying like, here are um, the things that made that so helpful for me, right? These are the reasons that you might consider playing this game rather than that one. Right? You're gonna play a video game. It's inevitable. I'm not going to say that all games are bad or anything like that, but I'm going to say like maybe certain games are going to have more to them and are going to be more worth your time in the long run. And so maybe you think about playing one of those games, right? So it's kind of that act of persuasion of teaching. We assign books to kids and they complain because they're being forced to read the book. And then later they look back and they say, wow, I'm glad that I read that book when I was that age, because there is this kind of formative time to encounter these works. I think it's very similar with video games. And most people are not empowered to assign video games. So what does that look like, right? Like there has to be a different maybe mechanism there. But yeah, all to say, I'm pretty uninterested in most millennial discourse, and I think that there are definitely works that repay revisiting. I don't think there's that many of them in the game medium, but I think they do exist. And I think that they certainly point towards the mythological and you know, literary themes that undergird the stories of those games. And that's I think at the end of the day what I would like uh to get people to think about. And it's not an easy task, um, because escapism in a superficial sense is a lot more attractive, a lot more fun than escapism in that deep sense of like breaking through to, uh, oh, like I really want to read the Odyssey now, or whatever it is, or Ovid's Metamorphoses, something weird like that. You know, like these kind of foundational texts for the culture of the world, right? They are connected and they're underlying um, all of these present day media, these popular media, um, how to like uncover them and really engage with them. Uh, to say nothing of like the kind of Zen, Buddhist, and then Christian scriptural like thing that was going on in Final Fantasy VII that we kept seeing come up there. I mean, that's that inevitable, given the time that these games came out, the way that they were accessed by different audiences. Um, it's I think that is where I'm most intrigued by saying like where is the discourse around that, and how could it how could it be uh,
That's really
brought
interesting
to the
because
fore?
I've heard you articulate this in a way like that, in a similar way before,
Hmm.
but now I think I'm understanding you somewhat differently. So to some extent, your thesis is that the late 90s was actually a golden age, and that the
Hmm.
people who were adolescents at that time were treated to a cadre of media that formed them in perhaps uniquely interesting way by exposing us not only to the West but to the East and Eastern
Mhm.
perceptions of the West too. Because I imagine in our next conversation we'll talk a little bit more about the setting of a garden with
Yes.
seeds in it. You know, this sort of paradisical Edenic Western Near Eastern concept of the garden in the Golden Age. And eventually it will become a celestial garden, right? It's on the earth and then it will move through the air. And there are multiple gardens too. So there's some sort of cosmopolitanism or pluralism there too, right? That and pluralism in that we have elements of Zen Buddhism, but then we have like Quetzalcoatl, which is like an Aztec deity,
Yeah.
free,
Right. Right.
a free to a sort of Arab, Middle Eastern deity like a jinn, Shiva, and then several others too, like Odin.
Siren. Right.
Yeah,
Hmm.
right. There is, in fact, I think the most powerful guardian force is named Eden in this particular
Mm.
iteration. And so your claim seems to be that in the same way that, say, cultures that only have one story, the people are obviously formed by that story, like and then how they relate to that story, given the ways that they act in their society and culture, and the roles that they fulfill with them. But that we were exposed to this, not only were we exposed to media that itself was jammed packed full of stories that perhaps don't naturally or have not chronologically or spatially gone together, but that they also so what it seems to be that you're saying is that because we were formed at a time when we experienced a new sort of media, the internet was also coming around at this time, and chat rooms and AOL and things. And so our capacity to explore diverse media exploded as young people, and we were super potentiated in our ability to do that. Not quite to the extent of people now who now our students are accessing the dark web and such, and growing and being born with phones in their hands. But we were exposed at this formative period to Eastern, Western ideas that I think that put permanent enigmas in our minds that made people, at least with creative temperaments or inquisitive temperaments, more likely to pursue the origins of these Eastern and Western ideas. Like, where did these gods, these systems of gods come from? And okay, they've been integrated together in this system of Final Fantasy VIII, but they're not integrated together in the mythological systems that they come from, which are themselves not necessarily opposed to each other, but don't fit together. Like Norse mythology does not fit with Aztec mythology, which does not fit with Christianity. I mean, one can sort of win and syncretically absorb them all together, right? Like how Milton does with the Greek and Egyptian gods in Paradise Lost. He throws them in hell. They're just fallen angels. And
Right. Right.
perhaps allegorically speaking, that is what a religion that has fallen out of favor is. We will have to talk about that. But it seems like your thesis is saying that because the games were so rich in mythological literary content, they created a path for people like us, young scholars, to walk down in order to see how deep the mysteries could be. We're represented as having these gods and these sort of visual and 10 to 14-year-old forms. But then as we age and develop more sophisticated researching skills or inquiring skills, then we're still left with these impressions of these gods and these mythological and these literary figures that then we develop the skills necessary to investigate at a higher level. And that the games these days and the middle 2020s are missing some of those substantive elements. And so young people who play those games rather than these will not have the same opportunities for inquiry into the nature of story and reality like we do. Is that a fair summation?
I
Is
think
that any
I
more?
think so. It might be, well, it might be going too far to say that games now don't have that. It might be closer to the mark to say the ways in which games now represent that make it easier to stay within the game rather than uncover and fill out the content underlying the game, right? It's kind of going back to the whole thing about the realism or the way that um, the graphics uh, put me off way back at the start, right? Um, it's something like that, and I don't know because I don't really play a lot of new games. I don't feel the need to, nor do I have really the inclination to, and um, and I know that that's a major flaw with going so far as to say, the games back when they were better, even in this like kind of strange way of saying it. So I don't know about that part, but yeah, but definitely there was a time when, to me, this was the the kind of trajectory that you would get set upon by playing some of these games. So I'm curious if that rings true for other people, especially people who are young right now. Can they kind of see that line of thinking still?
We'll have to. No, that's very fascinating. I makes me very much want to engage with somebody who has been, at the very least, a little more with it with video games for the last 20 years. Maybe somebody who's got a very strong opinion on the last several Final Fantasies at the least, and maybe
Hmm.
talk to us a little bit about the iterations and whether the integration of mythological material has been better, worse done, whether it's been thinner, thicker, or not. Because I am very interested in this thesis and exploring it because the video game time in which we grew up, in which we spent our basically 10 to 20, our second decade is
Hmm.
considered golden age. I was 12 in 1997, and which is awesome. Was an awesome time for me. And so, did we have a unique experience, or did we simply have the version of the experience that those people who are our age have, and that
Right.
experience remains open? Because that's sort of the Blade Runner 2 issue, right? If we are the chosen ones, awesome. But if we're not the chosen ones, then this is far more inclusive and good for
Yes.
good that the next generation can also discover the truths about reality that they seek. It would be terrible if that pathway had become blocked. But if it has become blocked, I think it's our duty to unblock it so that it can be trod again. And so hopefully if it is blocked, we like surgeons can unblock it like an artery, or like a low cholesterol diet. Perhaps we can be the low cholesterol diet for our listeners. Um, but a little more interesting. Not as bad as a diet, not as bad an experience.
Yeah.
um,
We are the Ozempic.
yeah, yes, we are the Ozempic generation, and so we could make a very interesting podcast on the relationship between that and Final Fantasy and work ethic or something like that. But maybe way down the list, because we have a lot of other things I think we need to talk about first. Though that may well come up, because part of the secondary value, I think, of any of these recordings is that they become anthropological evidence or historical evidence at some point, regardless of their artistic value on their own, right?
Mhm.
Like the things that we say that talk about the recent past 30 years ago, as opposed to what's going on right now, like the inauguration that just happened this very day,
Right.
will be elements that increase the value of this work for those who investigate in the future and want to understand what was going on here in early 2025. It's present now, but it will very soon be past. Um,
That's the way it works.
well, my friend, um, another wonderful conversation with you. Apologies to our listeners, our viewers, for Thrasymachus or my lack of mastery over Thrasymachus. He is a young shelter poodle or doodle of some sort, and I'm doing my best with him. But like this podcast, like all the video games we play, the work is ongoing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's okay. He's a puppy. I'll get
he
there.
yes, I mean, look at him.
Well, my cat has caught a mouse and is desperately trying to get it. I just threw this trash can over top of it to protect it from the cat. and the cat has figured out that it's under there and really wants it. So I'm gonna try to throw it outside here.
So this is where we end with us both returning to our somewhat paternal domestic duties,
Yeah,
which now we emphasize over entering into a virtual space and playing a video game now. Look at this, us doing chores without anybody telling us to. Perhaps the games did their.
responsibility. Yeah,
Your next task, my next task is keeping this dog happy, and yours is keeping this mouse away. It's very beginning of the RPG-esque, except for I guess now, like you once said when you first became a father, was NPC mode activated.
hmm Unlocked it. Yep, at last. All
Um,
right.
well, good luck with keeping your cat from the mouse, and I can't wait to talk more about this game and to hear whether you're playing it or watching it or reading
Yeah,
about it and how you're engaging with it.
sounds good. Thanks again.